I came home from the hospital still weak in my bones, grateful to have survived what almost took me. But the moment I stepped into my bedroom, I felt something wasn't right. It was too quiet, too untouched, too careful. And when I reached the old safe tucked behind my wardrobe, my heart began to race. Though I tried to calm my hands as I spun the dial, I opened it, expecting to feel the weight of my memories resting inside like they always had, waiting to comfort me. But what I saw instead was nothing. Just a hollow metal box staring back at me. Every piece of jewelry that told the story of my life was gone. And as I stood there in stunned silence, I could almost hear my heartbeat echo through that empty space. I didn't scream. I didn't fall apart. I just whispered to myself, someone I trusted has made a mistake. They can never take back. Thank you for watching my story and for spending your time with me. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because I believe every place holds its own kind of strength, and maybe yours can help carry me tonight. When I first saw that empty safe, my knees felt like they might give out. But I forced myself to stand still, because I had learned long ago that dignity is not something you wear on your neck or wrist, it is something you carry in your spine. I stared at that bare metal until my eyes began to sting, not just because my locket from my wedding day had vanished, or because the pearls I wore on my 40th anniversary were gone, or even because the bracelet my late husband gave me after I beat cancer had disappeared. It was the betrayal that truly wounded me. Knowing someone who once called me precious had decided I was no longer worth the truth. I reached out and gently touched the back of the empty safe, the way a mother touches a crib where her baby once lay. And I felt colder than I had in that hospital bed. I tried to steady my breath as one single thought curled through my mind, as slowly as winter frost. Whoever did this believed I was too weak to fight back, too old to remember what belonged to me. They believed my silence would be surrender. They were wrong, because silence can sometimes become the sharpest weapon of all. I did not rush to call anyone or make a scene. Instead, I walked slowly to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, though my hands were shaking, because I was not just thirsty, I was trying to swallow everything I was feeling. I kept remembering the day my grandson Liam helped me tuck that very safe behind the wardrobe, telling me it was safer there, because no one would ever think to look behind all my old coats. I remembered how he used to kiss my cheek before leaving my house, saying he would always protect me. I gave him my spare house key, not because I ever expected him to use it for anything more than checking on my flowers or dusting around when I was away, but because I trusted him more than I trusted myself. I thought love meant never questioning intentions, but standing there alone with the taste of cold water on my tongue, I realized I should have known that some hearts grow hungry when they smell inheritance. I thought of every sacrifice I made in silence, skipping new shoes so I could give him money during his college years, pawning my own golden brooch once to help him buy his first car, because he told me it would help him find a better job. I remembered writing cards with shaky hands every birthday, and slipping folded bills inside so he could feel supported even when my bones ached. But none of that mattered anymore, because all it took was my illness and my absence for him to slice my trust open and sell its pieces online, like trinkets with no story. I pressed my hand flat on the kitchen counter, trying to steady my breathing. I whispered aloud that grief is not always loud. Sometimes it seeps in quietly and fills every corner of your soul until your hope feels heavy. I lifted my head after a moment and wiped my face, because I needed to decide whether I would crumble or become unbreakable. I looked toward the hallway that led back to the empty safe, and I made a promise to myself that no matter how much it hurt, I would get everything back, even if it meant letting go of him forever. I would not raise my voice, I would not beg, I would not fight the way he expected me to. Instead, I would show him that I might be old, but I still know how to protect what time has taught me to treasure. I walked down the hallway with my back straighter than it had been in months, refusing to let the weakness of my body decide the strength of my spirit. And I opened the drawer, where I kept every document I had ever guarded, like a soldier keeps letters from home during war. My late husband always said that being prepared was better than being powerful. So I pulled out the inventory list he helped me create years ago. After someone broke into our neighbor's house, every item was listed in my neat handwriting, traced with the patience of a woman who knows that someday everything she owns might need to be proven. I carried that list in my trembling hand back to the bedroom and stood beside the open safe, reading each line as if I were saying goodbye to old friends. I closed my eyes and remembered the first time I wore my wedding locket, glancing at myself in the mirror with nerves fluttering in my stomach while my husband buttoned his cuffs behind me, smiling like I was the most unforgettable thing he had ever seen. I remembered the pearls he surprised me with at my 40th birthday dinner, when he stood up in front of our friends and said I was the reason he believed in miracles. I remembered the delicate bracelet he gave me after I survived cancer because he said I had beaten death itself and deserved to feel precious every day that followed. I opened my eyes and realized that my grandson had not just stolen jewelry, he had stolen my proof that love had once been faithful. He had taken my memories and listed them in a place where strangers would bid with cold fingers, never knowing they were buying pieces of my heart. My throat tightened so much I could hardly breathe, but I would not cry, because tears felt too gentle for what he had done. I pulled myself together and stepped into my living room, where sunlight filtered through the curtains in thin yellow streams that made everything look almost peaceful, though my spirit was raging underneath. I picked up my handbag, placed the inventory list inside, along with an old photograph of me wearing all 3 pieces like armor of happiness. And I slowly walked to the door, locking it behind me, as though I was locking away the version of myself that had once trusted too easily. The walk to the police station felt longer than any journey I had taken, even though it was only a few streets away. Each step reminded me that I was not walking there because I was fragile, but because I remembered every sacrifice I had made in silence. Every night I stayed awake, worrying about my family while they slept soundly without fear. By the time I reached the station, my shoes were dusty and my palms were damp, but I knew I was doing what had to be done. I greeted the officer with a quiet hello and calmly handed over the photograph and the inventory list. I told him someone had stolen my most valuable possessions while I was fighting for my life. He looked at me with sympathy and suggested I sit. But instead, I stood firm, because strength sometimes comes from refusing to lower yourself, even when your legs beg you to. I answered every question carefully, spelling my grandson's name slowly, explaining that I did not want to ruin his life, but I needed to protect what was left of mine. I watched the officer type everything into his computer, and I heard the clacking of the keys, like a steady drum of justice waking from its sleep. When he told me they would trace the pawn shops, I nodded and thanked him. But deep inside, I felt something new blooming. It was not anger nor revenge. It was a quiet resolve. The kind that grows when a woman realizes she is done giving second chances to those who treat her love like scraps. By the time I stepped back out into the sunlight, I felt lighter, even though the weight of grief still rested on my chest, because I knew I had taken the first step, not toward recovering my jewelry, but toward recovering myself. When I returned home from the police station, I boiled a pot of tea, though my hands were still trembling because I needed something warm to remind me I was still alive and full of spirit. I sat in my quiet living room, listening to the faint ticking of the clock and thinking about how time had changed the boy who once ran through my garden with laughter into the man who now sold my memories online for pocket change. I did not know whether the police would recover my jewelry or if the pieces were already scattered in boxes across the country. But what I did know was that I would never again allow him to step over my threshold with that same smile I once trusted. I reached for my will tucked inside my drawer and slowly crossed out his name. My heart heavy, but my decision firm. In its place, I wrote a single sentence that felt more powerful than any punishment I could give. Trust is more valuable than gold. I knew that message would outlive me and echo louder than any confrontation could offer. Not long after I set down my pen, my phone began to ring with his name flashing across the screen over and over. But I did not answer. because forgiveness should not be handed out like spare coins to someone who gambled with my soul. Instead, I sat back and watched the sunlight shift across my floor, as I realized with a strange calm that I might have lost my jewelry, but I had found something far more precious: the strength to protect my heart without raising my voice. So I leaned back in my chair and let the phone ring, knowing that while he was crying for mercy, I had already chosen peace over pain, and no amount of pleading could ever unlock the doors I had quietly closed forever. The calls kept coming until my phone grew hot against the table from his desperate attempts to make me listen. When he realized I would not pick up, he began to send messages filled with apologies and excuses, promising he would replace everything he took, even though we both knew some things cannot be bought back once trust has been broken. I read his words slowly while stirring my tea, letting each message remind me that choices carry consequences, no matter how loudly someone begs for them to be erased. I remembered the sleepless nights I once spent worrying whether he had eaten enough during his college years, only to now see him so full of boldness that he could empty my safe without a flicker of shame. I remembered the afternoons I waited by the window just to see his car pull up, because I loved nothing more than making him feel welcome. But now that same window reflected a woman who was finally done waiting to be respected. I placed my phone face down because I did not want his last words to distract me from what I had already decided. I spent the next few hours sorting through old photo albums and important papers, because I needed to make sure that my legacy would never again be left vulnerable in the hands of someone who had proven they cared more about money than memories. I dug out a small metal lockbox my husband had once brought home from a flea market, saying it was ugly enough to be overlooked, but strong enough to guard diamonds. I cleaned it gently and placed it at the back of my closet, then carefully tucked inside the deed to my home. And every sentimental letter my husband ever wrote to me, I felt a quiet satisfaction bloom in my chest as I organized my life anew. Because this time, I was not trying to impress anyone or make them proud. I was simply protecting the pieces of myself that still remained untouched. Late that evening, as I sat watching the sun dip below the trees, I whispered that I forgave myself for trusting blindly, but I would not forgive him for choosing greed over loyalty. I thought about how he would likely continue calling and maybe even show up at my door with tears in his eyes, but I was prepared now, in ways I had never been before. When someone shows you their heart, do not pretend you did not see it. When they show you their darkness, do not try to convince yourself it is just a shadow. I had seen his darkness, and I chose to step out of its reach. So as the sky grew darker, I lit my lamp, not as an invitation, but as a quiet reminder to myself that even after betrayal there can still be light, as long as you refuse to let your spirit be dimmed by those who never truly valued it. Days passed with silence wrapped around my house like an old quilt, until one morning I heard soft footsteps on my porch, followed by a timid knock that barely touched the wood. I opened my curtains just enough to see him standing there dressed neatly, as though he believed tidiness could cover his guilt. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, and he rocked on his heels like a little boy waiting to be scolded. He called my name gently through the door, begging me to forgive him, saying he had made a terrible mistake and that he would do anything to make it right. I stood quietly behind the curtain, watching him plead, as though I were a stranger listening to a story about someone else. I thought about unlocking the door for a brief moment, until my heart reminded me that forgiveness does not belong to those who only cry when consequences come home to roost. Forgiveness belongs to those who treasure your trust so fiercely they would never dream of breaking it in the first place. I stepped back from the window without making a sound and let him remain out there with his sorrow. After a while, I heard his voice crack as he promised he would never hurt me again. But even his desperation could not erase the image of him walking into that pawn shop, carrying my memories with such ease. I waited until his voice faded into the distance, and then I finally opened my front door, only to pick up the small envelope he had slipped under it. Inside was a crumpled note saying he loved me, and enclosed was a cheap imitation bracelet he must have bought in a hurry, hoping I would believe he had recovered what he stole. I held it between my fingers, feeling its flimsy weight, and laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it reminded me how far he was willing to go to avoid facing the truth. I placed the fake bracelet in my drawer next to the real ones that might someday be returned. And I whispered that love without respect is only pretending. From that day forward, I stopped waiting for the doorbell, and I stopped listening for his calls. Instead, I poured all my attention into living the rest of my days with grace and calm and the kind of pride that cannot be purchased or stolen. I spent my afternoons tending to my rose bushes, writing letters to friends I had not seen in years, and finding new ways to smile even when my heart was still healing. Because I knew that losing my jewelry did not break me, betrayal did not bury me, and while I could not choose who hurt me, I could choose how I rose from it. So I stood tall and carried on, knowing some lessons come wrapped in pain, but leave behind a strength no thief can ever touch. Weeks later, I received a call from the officer handling my case. He told me they had located 2 of my pieces in a pawn shop several towns away, and asked if I would like to come in to identify them. I agreed with a steady voice, though my heart raced, as though I were being reunited with long-lost children. When I arrived at the station, they laid the jewelry out carefully on a white cloth, as if they understood that this was not just about stolen goods, but about years of laughter, tears, and triumphs. I picked up my wedding locket first, and felt a rush of emotion so powerful that my knees swayed slightly, because suddenly I was 20 years old again, standing beside my husband under a canopy of love and promises. Then I touched the pearl necklace and remembered my 40th birthday, when I danced under dim lights, believing life could offer nothing more perfect. I thanked the officer with a tearful smile and held those pieces close to me for the entire journey home, refusing to place them in my handbag, because after everything they had endured, I wanted my heartbeat to remind them they were finally safe again. Once back in my house, I opened my new lockbox and placed them inside, gently whispering that they belonged only to someone who would never betray them again. As I turned the key, I felt something inside me locked firmly into place as well. A new kind of truth, the belief that even though betrayal had walked right through my door, I had not allowed it to define me. I had fought back, not with rage, but with patience, not with shouting, but with quiet determination. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, basking in the sunlight that streamed across my table. I thought about my grandson, and for a moment my heart ached with the memory of who he used to be. But I no longer felt the need to chase that version of him. Some people change and leave you with no choice but to protect yourself, even if it means closing the door to someone you once cradled in your arms. I have learned that forgiveness is a gift and not an obligation, and peace is worth far more than any apology. So as I sipped my tea, I whispered to myself that I had done all I could do. I had stood my ground, reclaimed what mattered, and in doing so, I had rediscovered the strongest version of myself, even in my twilight years. As the days grew calmer, I found my strength returning in ways I had not expected. Instead of waking with heartache, I began rising with purpose, once again lighting the stove for breakfast, humming the same gentle songs I had once sung while rocking my child, long before betrayal had sharpened my awareness. I spent my mornings sewing small patches onto my worn aprons and polishing the edges of picture frames that held captured moments of true joy. Moments untouched by lies. In the afternoons, I started taking long walks through my neighborhood, greeting people with a smile, because I wanted them to see that even after everything I had endured, I had not been destroyed. Often I paused at the corner bakery, where the young girl behind the counter would hand me warm bread and ask how my day was. I would tell her softly that life is full of surprises, some bitter and some sweet. But as long as we keep breathing, we must continue to choose hope. In the evenings, I placed fresh flowers from my garden into a vase beside my lockbox, as a symbol that healing can blossom even in soil once soaked with tears. Sometimes I would think briefly of my grandson, wondering if he truly understood the damage he had done, but I no longer clung to the pain of it like before. I let the memory drift through me like a passing storm rather than settle like thunder, because I had learned the greatest revenge is not loud or cruel. It is simply living well, holding your head high, and refusing to hand your peace to the person who tried to break you. So I continued on with gentle power, surrounding myself with small acts of self-respect every day, trusting that the universe watches over those who love fiercely and without fear. I understood now that while my jewelry had been precious and my trust even more so, the most valuable thing I had always possessed was the ability to rise again whenever life tried to push me down. And with that truth stitched quietly into my heart, I moved forward into each new dawn, ready to live the rest of my days with dignity, unshaken by those who chose greed over grace. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I was sitting in my garden trimming the roses when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. And though I normally let strangers go straight to voicemail, something urged me to answer. On the other end was a woman from a jewelry restoration shop, several counties away, saying my bracelet had been brought in by someone attempting to clean it before resale, and that she had recognized my name engraved faintly on the inside clasp. She informed me that she held it behind the counter after growing suspicious, and asked if I wished to retrieve it. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me that a stranger had cared enough to protect something so precious. I thanked her over and over while my fingers brushed the petals of my roses. Because in that moment I realized that even when people close to you mislead you, there are still kind souls in this world who will step in without being asked. After arranging its return, I hung up the phone and looked at the sky, feeling as though the pieces of myself that had once been scattered were slowly finding their way back home. I collected my gardening tools and went inside, placing them in their usual spot, before changing into a modest dress the way I once did when my husband took me dancing, and I looked at myself in the mirror. Not as a broken woman, but as someone who had survived loss and disappointment without losing compassion. I glanced at my new lockbox in the closet and smiled softly, knowing that I may have once trusted blindly, but now I trusted wisely. I walked to my kitchen window and watched the evening sun fall across the fence, thinking about how life seldom gives back what is taken. Yet somehow I had been given a rare gift of return. I whispered that sometimes faith comes dressed as coincidence, and that maybe justice has its own quiet timing. I poured myself a fresh glass of water and sat with my back straight, feeling calm, because I knew I had handled my betrayal with honor, not bitterness, and that in doing so I had shown myself and anyone who might be listening that strength is not in how loudly you roar, but in how gently you stand firm in your worth. Not long after the bracelet returned into my hands, I received another surprise in the mail. A small handwritten letter from a young woman who said she had purchased my pearls online, only to discover that the engraving on the clasp did not match the name of the seller, who claimed they were family heirlooms passed down to him. She explained she had done a quick search out of curiosity and found the police report online, along with the description of my missing pieces. She wrote that she believed those pearls rightfully belonged to me, and included her address so I could reach out if I wished to collect them. I sat there holding her letter as tears filled my eyes, not from sadness but from the unexpected kindness of strangers stepping in where blood had failed. I wrote her back immediately, thanking her for her honesty, and arranged a day to meet. When I traveled to pick up the pearls, I brought with me a small bouquet of roses from my garden as a token of gratitude, because I wanted her to know that goodness should never go unnoticed. As I placed the pearls gently around my neck, again I felt an undeniable warmth spread through my chest, because for the first time since I discovered my safe empty, I felt almost whole again. Walking back into my home that afternoon, I thought about how life has a strange way of guiding us toward healing through the hands of people we have never met. I also thought about my grandson, and whether he understood yet that some things cannot be dismantled with an auction listing or erased with fake tears. I set my pearls in the lockbox beside the locket and bracelet and closed it with care, knowing that though I had regained them, I would never return to the woman I was before the betrayal. There are certain moments that break you open and leave you raw, perhaps, so that new wisdom can grow in the places where naivety once lived. I made myself a warm bowl of soup and sat at my kitchen table, reflecting on the strange journey I had walked. I realized that even as I had fought to protect what was mine, I had uncovered something far more powerful, resilience woven into every corner of my spirit, just waiting for the right storm to call it forth. It dawned on me that no matter what else I might lose in the future, I would forever hold on to this lesson, that survival is not always loud or triumphant. Sometimes it is quiet, graceful, and forged in the unwavering belief that you deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter who tries to strip it away. With all three pieces safely back where they belonged, I thought perhaps my heart would rest fully at last. But instead, I found myself lying awake at night, wondering how many other elders had suffered silently at the hands of those they once trusted with everything. I imagined others returning from hospitals to homes stripped not just of valuables, but of faith in their own blood. And that thought weighed heavily on me, until it nudged me into a decision I never expected to make at my age. I reached for a notebook and wrote a letter to my local community paper, sharing my experience without naming my grandson, because I did not wish to ruin his future entirely, even though he had been so ready to ruin mine. I told my story as a warning to remind others to trust wisely, to keep inventories, to protect their memories as fiercely as they protect their savings. A few weeks after my letter was published, I received responses from strangers both near and far, thanking me for speaking up because they too had faced similar betrayals but lacked the strength or clarity to act. They called me brave, though I did not feel brave. I simply felt necessary. As I read their messages, I realized that my suffering had become a lantern for others, showing them that even quiet women in their final chapters could still create ripples of change. Recognizing the impact of sharing, I contacted a small charity that provides legal support for seniors who face financial abuse, and I offered to volunteer my time writing letters and making phone calls to raise awareness. Each call I made filled me with renewed purpose, because I felt as though I had turned my heartbreak into a shield for others. I no longer spent my afternoons nursing bitterness or grief, but rather investing my energy into helping protect those who might otherwise suffer in secret. In doing so, I discovered a deeper peace, the kind that lingers softly, even when shadows of the past try to creep back in. I often sat by my window watching the world move on, knowing that while I could not change what had happened to me, I had transformed its meaning by refusing to stay silent. I whispered to myself that strength is not in the jewelry I wear, but in the voice I use to make sure no one else loses theirs again. Over time, I noticed that my days began to fill not with reminders of betrayal, but with small, steady moments of joy. I found comfort in routine again, sipping warm tea on my porch, listening to the birds that still returned each morning, and watching the light change across the walls as the sun moved. I no longer waited for apologies that would never come, or held space in my heart for people who treated my love like something disposable. Instead, I focused on what remained, what had survived, and what was slowly blooming back into strength. I began to write more letters, not just to others but to myself. Quiet notes tucked into drawers and coat pockets. Reminders that dignity is not about being untouched by pain, but about what you choose to do after pain meets you at your doorstep. I smiled more, laughed when the kettle hissed too long, or when my cat knocked something over as if to demand attention. I even pulled out an old recipe book and started baking again, because healing, I've learned, is fed not just by forgiveness, but by living fully, despite what was taken. My home no longer felt like a place of loss, but a space I had rebuilt one act of grace at a time. And now, as I sit here finishing the last few lines of this story, I want to thank you sincerely for staying with me. Your support means more than you may ever realize. If my voice has resonated with your own experiences, I warmly invite you to subscribe so we can continue to walk together through stories that honor resilience, protect dignity, and remind us all that even after betrayal, hope can still bloom.